and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, we focus our full attention on the war in Ukraine. This as President Zelenskyy says his country needs another 2 or 3 years of European financial support to continue fighting Russia. Well, in this edition, we'll get the latest on the battlefield tactics. We'll talk about which weapons could make the most difference, and we'll ask US diplomats what sort of a difference the latest sanctions are making. Hello and welcome. Straight to Ukraine. And we've been hearing several statements out of the Kremlin during the course of today. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has responded to President Donald Trump's latest sanctions on Russian oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil. Peskov said that despite President Trump's calls for countries to stop buying Russian oil, he's confident that Russia's partners will make their own decisions. He added that Russian commodities offer the highest quality at competitive prices. Well, on the diplomatic front, efforts to end the war, Kremlin is blaming Kyiv for the latest stalemate, saying that Ukraine has not been answering Moscow's questions. The spokesperson also claimed that Russian troops are hearing foreign languages amongst the ranks of fighters on the front line and vowed that those fighters would be destroyed. Well, the US-led NATO military alliance says that despite its strong support for Ukraine, they have not deployed any soldiers there. Well into its 4th year, drone warfare remains a key part of the war in Ukraine. The UN is accusing Russia of using drones to target civilians near the front line, saying it has created a climate of terror, which has forced thousands of people to flee. And investigators say this could amount to a crime against humanity. Well, Russia and Ukraine have been trading blame for civilian attacks during the course of the war, but both are continuing to deny this. Well, let's discuss this a little bit more now, and we can speak to Sir Gerald Howarth, who is a former UK Defence Minister. He joins us from Suffolk in the United Kingdom. We're also joined by Antikov, who is a political analyst based in Moscow. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Andrew, let me start with you. I'd like both of you to set out your positions, but tell us, Andrew, 2,000 Ukrainian civilians have been reported killed this year. More than 14,000 have been killed since the start of the war nearly 4 years ago. What is Russia's justification? What's Russia trying to achieve here?
Well, of course, Russia does not target civilians in Ukraine. What we need is to find a solution, a peaceful solution. Unfortunately, what we see is that there is an escalation from European countries, from the United States. Instead of discussing the real solution, peaceful solution, the ways to achieve this solution, we see that Ukraine is still receiving lots of weapons from Western countries, and so on and so on. This is the real problem. I think the problem is that we see that the Western countries found some committees. They discuss the ways to deploy their soldiers in Ukraine after the ceasefire. They discuss how to exploit Russian assets and so on and so on. But they discuss it. They ignore Russian position. This is the real problem. They behave as there is no Russia on the world map.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying this is all the fault of interests. This is all the fault of the Europeans, you're saying, and that they need to. They're responsible for prolonging the war. So, Gerald, let me ask you to respond to some of those comments that Andrew just made.
Well, of course, it's crystal clear to the entire world that it was Russia which launched an unprovoked, brutal aggression against a sovereign state, Ukraine. There was absolutely no justification for it. Indeed, Russia had already annexed Crimea in 2014. They have been undertaking military activity in the Donbass eastern region of Ukraine since 2014. And this is the most disgusting modern assault upon a sovereign state, and in complete breach of an agreement which Andrei's former president of Russia had signed. Boris Yeltsin had signed an agreement with Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States, under which the parties agreed to respect the sovereignty, independence, and existing borders of Ukraine. This is the most brutal and violent aggression against another country. And all that we are doing is to help Ukraine to fulfill that duty which Russia has reneged upon, namely to ensure that the existing borders of Ukraine should be respected. The idea that Andrei says that Russia is not targeting civilians, we see on our television screens every night, we see civilian blocks of flats that have been targeted by Russia. Andrei needs to understand that it is his president who has been charged with war crimes at the International Criminal Court. And he needs to understand that the entire respected international community finds this an absolute, utter, contemptible disgrace.
Okay, Andrei, some strong words there from Sir Gerald. Feel free to respond to any of that. And let me also ask you, I mean, what is Russia achieving on the battlefield? Have there been any strategic breakthroughs?
Well, we see that Russia has freed lots of territories in the former Ukraine, so to say, former Ukraine. I talk here about Donbass, some other territories, and so there is a straight way, ground way from the Russian territories to Crimea. This is very important for us because before this operation, there was only a bridge that connected the Crimea with the other Russian territories. So the achievement is clear for everybody, but we insist on withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Donbass, from Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. So this is the main Russian condition. And also we need to discuss the future of Ukraine. I mean here that I mentioned previously that the European countries discussed the deployment of Western soldiers from Western countries in Ukraine, but this is absolutely unacceptable for Russia. Well, there is lots of talks about ceasefire in Ukraine. This is also unacceptable for Russia. Let's imagine that Russia agrees with ceasefire. I'll tell you what's going to happen next. During a couple of months, this ceasefire will be stable, but during this time, Ukraine will get some reinforcements. Ukraine will get more weapons from Western countries, and after that, Russia will be accused of something, and the combat will start.
But Andrei,
this is the problem. That's why we don't need.
Okay. Okay, Andrei, let's Sir Gerald respond to that.
Andrei, forgive me. It's not your country. You said that you need to hold the Donbass in order to get access to overland to Crimea. Crimea does not belong to you. Crimea belongs to Ukraine. And you have seized Crimea by military force. And now you justify taking the Donbass in order to give you somebody else's country so that you can access another part of that person's country. This is absolutely disgusting. And the idea that the Europeans are somehow ramping up, escalating, no, we are not. We are helping Ukraine to fight off an evil and brutal aggressor in the form of you and your people. And it's, I don't know if you've been watching, but there are people in St. Petersburg who are beginning to complain about the way that President Putin is conducting this brutal aggression against another country. There are Russians who are speaking up. And of course, in Russia, it's pretty well a crime to speak up. And so you need to understand, we are going to stand firm behind Ukraine. We are going to support them because your brutal aggression, your seizing of Ukrainian children and taking them to indoctrinate them in Russia in the 21st century, this is absolutely and utterly despicable, Andrei.
Andrei?
Well, let's talk about Iraq then, or maybe Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. But I want to respond that we talk about, as you say, Russian aggression as if Russia has decided to make this step, just as if there was nothing before that. But I would like to remind you that before what happened in the year 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine, a coup. a military coup. And after this coup, the people were killed by new Ukrainian Nazi government in Ukraine and in Donbass. This is the real problem. That's why Russia has ended this case. And there was a referendum in Crimea, after that in Donbass, and anybody can go to Crimea now and ask people if they are happy with that decision from the year 2014. And I'm sure that most of them will be happy with that. They will say that they are Russian people, they're happy to be with Russia, inside Russia. This is the thing that the Western countries do not want to
Russia has no idea.
So, Gerald?
Russia has no idea how to hold free elections. The referendum in the Donbass was rigged, as elections in Russia are rigged. And when you say there was a coup in 2014, because you have no idea of democracy in Russia. You eliminate people who stand up against the Kremlin. There was no coup in 2014. The Ukrainian people voted for a different leadership. And the Ukrainian people would like to join the European Union. I personally wanted Britain to leave the European Union, and we have. And we had a free vote in this country. But in Ukraine, they would like to join the European Union. That must be a decision for them. It's not a decision for you. What arrogance you are trying to assert over the Ukrainian people. It's not for you. It's not for the Kremlin to decide who represents the people of Ukraine. It's the Ukrainian people. But as you have such little understanding of democracy in Russia, I quite understand why you do not accept the position in Ukraine. And don't call them Nazis. That is really quite revolting. The Nazis murdered 6 million Jews. They are not murdering civilians in Ukraine. The people who are doing that sort of activity are your people. Because don't forget, you poisoned a couple here in the United Kingdom. You sent agents here and you poisoned them in Salisbury, in our country.
Okay, Andrew, I'll let you respond to that and we'll move on to my next question after that.
I'd like to remind everybody that what happened in the year 2014, there was an agreement reached by President Viktor Yanukovych and the opposition leaders. The agreement that established a transitional period, and after that the presidential elections must be held. This agreement was also signed by some European countries. Instead of that, the day after that, after assignment of this agreement, there was a coup in Ukraine. This is the problem. President Yanukovych had to flee. This is not a democracy. It's a military coup. And after that, we saw people burned alive in Odessa, in the city of Odessa, by Nazi forces, Ukrainian Nazi forces. We saw the people in Crimea. They were heavily stressed by what happened in Ukraine. So once again, there are lots of media in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in European countries, in the Arab world. Any journalist can go to the Crimea and ask people, freely ask people, what do they think about current events and what happened in the year 2014. Everybody is happy. Why? Why? Because Russia started to invest many money in the Crimea. They started to build infrastructure. Crimea, during those years before 2014, was actually left by the Ukrainian government. Corruption, no investments, nothing. Yeah, Soviet buildings, and this is what was in Crimea during all those years. After the year 2014, new airports were built, new roads were built, new hospitals were built there. This is the thing what Russia did. Are people happy with that? For sure they are. But this, again, this is the thing that the European countries, the United States, do not want to recognize. They don't see what people really think, people in the streets.
So you're saying that the Russian forces liberated Crimea, is that what you're basically saying? And that it's a much happier place than it used to be? Is that your argument?
I want to say that the Russian forces did not liberate Crimea, but they have made the conditions for people to make their choices, and this choice has been made. And I think nobody in Crimea rejects that choice made in the year 2014. Okay. This is the main thing, because yeah.
Let's let Sir Gerald respond to that.
They're not in a position to object. The fact is that you overran Crimea. Russia annexed Crimea to turn it into part of Russia. And as you have just admitted, and I hope people are watching this Al Arabiya interview in the Gulf states, heard it loud and clear from the man from Moscow who said that the reason why Russia insists on keeping the land that they have illegally seized, that is in eastern Ukraine, the so-called Donbass region of Ukraine, the reason they have seized it is to give them land access to the land they have already seized in Crimea, contrary to an agreement signed by their own president in 1995. It is just an absolute and utter disgrace and a complete affront to the world order. But then Russia has become a pariah. And if the people in Crimea have benefited from hospitals, well, I suspect there are people in other parts of Russia which are not benefiting from anything at the moment, because all the money that Russia has got is being spent on armaments to reinforce a military operation which was only supposed to last 3 days, but they didn't reckon with the patriotism and determination of the people of Ukraine to resist this aggression.
Okay, Andrei, let me turn back to you, because one of the things that the Kremlin's been saying today is that intelligence sources have been intercepting voices, foreign voices on the front line, implying that there's foreign involvement supporting Ukraine. I want to ask you why this is significant in your opinion.
We see that this position is obvious for us. I mentioned previously that they claim to start a ceasefire there. This is not acceptable for Russia. I told previously that if Russia agrees with that, then it doesn't mean that Ukraine will stop receiving reinforcements, that Ukraine will stop receiving weapons from different countries. Well, Russia says maybe we could agree with a ceasefire, but on condition that all the military activities must be stopped. Of course, Ukraine does not agree, the European countries do not agree. So when we talk about a ceasefire, we absolutely understand that the European countries, the United States, Ukraine itself, want to use this chance to get stronger, to restart the fighting in the future. Maybe after a month or 2 months, but it's obvious for everybody that that's only a little break. This ceasefire will not lead to a peace solution for Ukrainian crisis. Instead of that, we need to sit down, we need to join the negotiations, and we need to respect mutual positions. This is what Russia insists on. The problem is that everybody discusses the guarantees for Ukraine.
Sir Gerald?
There is not a mutual position here. There is not a mutual position here. Discuss our mutual positions. Discussing the current combat line, where Russia occupies somebody else's country, and that country is fighting to stop your country taking even more of their land. That is not acceptable. And when you talk about foreign involvement, Tom, let's not forget that Russia imported something like 10,000 North Koreans to come and fight in their support in eastern Ukraine. There is, as far as I'm aware, there are no NATO troops in Ukraine supporting Ukraine. Yes, we are supporting Ukraine in many other ways. We are supporting them in the development of their drone industry, which is, I have seen at first hand in Lviv when I was there earlier this year. We are doing everything we can. My son-in-law is Shadow Secretary of State for Defense. When he was Minister for Defense Procurement, he was helping to ensure Ukraine was armed with drones as well. We are going to do everything, Andrei, to prevent this brutal regime of yours from seizing another country in complete violation of an agreement which your president signed. So be under no illusions. And and this soft speak about a ceasefire that we would reinforce. Sure, we are going to reinforce Ukraine every bit we possibly can because, Andre, if we do not succeed in driving out your forces from the land that they have seized in Ukraine, your president will turn to other countries and seek to impose the same brutal aggression on them as he has imposed upon Ukraine. He is intent upon rebuilding the Soviet Union, and I heard you use the word Soviet earlier because you're obviously part of that old regime. It's yesterday's history, but which is what President Putin wishes to rebuild, and it was a threat to the world, and it was only thanks to Mikhail Gorbachev that peace came to Europe.
Okay, Andre, lots for you to reply to there. And notably, I saw you shaking your head when Sir Gerald mentioned there are 10,000 North Koreans or thereabouts helping Russia on the front line. How do you respond to that? And how do you respond to the notion that President Putin is simply trying to reconstruct the Soviet Union here?
Just give me a second. This is what I'm talking about. Well, the European countries, what I heard from a guest, the European countries want to defeat Russia. This is the thing. They want to defeat Russia instead of discussing the
we want to drive them out of Ukraine. We're not seeking to defeat Russia. We're seeking to we're seeking to help Ukraine drive your people out of a country you do not own. That is what we are seeking to do.
When you destroyed Yugoslavia, you didn't mind the Russian opinion. When you destroyed Yugoslavia, you didn't mind the Russian opinion. You destroyed a whole country, a big country. You crushed it in the lots of countries. This is the problem.
Let's stick with the present day. Let's stick to Ukraine.
Aggression against Ukraine. So let's get back to Ukraine. That's what I mean. The European countries talk about defeating Russia. It's not acceptable if they behave so.
So Gerald says that they're not talking about defeating. They're not trying to defeat Russia. They're trying to help Ukraine to defend its sovereign borders. That's what Sir Gerald is saying, I think.
What's the difference? What's the difference between the two issues?
The difference is that we are not seeking to
helping Ukraine means defeating Russia.
We're not seeking to destroy Moscow. You are seeking to destroy Kyiv, and we are trying to protect Kyiv. That is the fundamental difference. And if you do not understand that, either you are not very intelligent, and I suspect you are quite intelligent, or else you're just a spokesman for a most corrupt regime operating the Kremlin, which I think is behind you.
Okay, let's let Andre respond to this.
Well, I can assure you, if Russia really wanted to destroy Kyiv, it would really did it. As the NATO forces destroyed lots of parts of Belgrade previously in Yugoslavia, but we see that the center of Kyiv is not destroyed. President Zelenskyy is there. Lots of leaders arrive in Kyiv, and they hold negotiations with the Ukrainian government. Russia does not want to destroy Kyiv or any other.
People aren't going to Kyiv thanks to the goodwill of the Russian people or the president of Russia. They're able to go to Kyiv because, notwithstanding the astonishing bombardment that you are unleashing on the capital of Ukraine and upon their other cities, notwithstanding that, the Ukrainians have been able to shoot down so many of the drones that you are directing to them. Not all of them, of course, have successfully been successfully shot down, but they have shot down a lot. You are basically not winning. It is a stalemate at the moment, and you are just expending your young men, using them as cannon fodder, which again I just think is a complete and utter contempt.
Okay, Andre, let me turn back to you. I'd like to ask you, as we sort of bring this discussion to a conclusion, how do you see this war in Ukraine ending, and when?
When, it's a good question. We don't know, because we see different positions. As I mentioned previously, the European countries insist on defeating Russia. Russia says, it makes Russia to fight more. This is the problem. How That's a better question, because I think that what Russia sees is that Ukrainian territory must be a territory that, so to say, divides Russia and European countries. It means that no to European military presence in Ukraine, no to Ukraine and NATO, and so on and so on. So Ukraine must be a neutral country. Ukraine must be without any forces from the United States, European countries, or any other countries that supplied Ukraine with military weapons or any other military assistance. This is the real way to find a solution. But in common, I can say that the way to find this solution, I think, is that the other countries should respect or at least hear the Russian position.
Andrew,
at the moment they ignore it absolutely. As I mentioned, as if there is no Russia on the world map. This is not the way to find a solution for this crisis.
Okay, so Andrew, you think that President Putin really is serious about wanting peace?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, Sir Gerald, how do you respond?
Putin has done absolutely nothing to bring about peace. He's got the President of the United States around his little finger. He has dragged out the negotiations because he is trying to win a military battle in another country by seizing all the territory that he's not yet seized. And if he can't seize it all, by insisting that the whole of the Donbass, including that which Russian forces have so far failed to secure, that is given over to Russia. It is just simply unacceptable. And the idea that the Ukraine, it's a sovereign country, Andrei. It's just the same as, well, it's not, of course, the same as Russia, but it enjoys the same status as Russia. It is a free country. The idea that it has got to be neutral, that it cannot sign alliances it wishes to sign, that nobody should be allowed to occupy or to take part in peace support operations to prevent your country doing again what it has done twice in Ukraine. I mean, this is absurd. You cannot tell another country that is what they've got to do. If they want to join NATO, in my view, they should be allowed to join NATO. And Andrei, you should understand, Sweden and Finland have been neutral since the end of the Second World War. And because of your president's action, because of Russia's belligerence, those two countries asked, in the aftermath of the attack on Ukraine, they asked to join NATO, ceasing to be neutral, but joining NATO. Why? Because they fear for you. Poland fears for you. Not one of those countries, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, wants to be involved with you again. That should say something about you. And that is why I'm afraid Russia does not occupy the status on the world stage that it used to. It is not because it is something like the 20th, 21st economy in the world. It is not that there are any products here in the United Kingdom that I want to go into the shops to buy from Russia. You don't produce anything I want to buy. All you have is oil and natural resources. Russia has brought about its own reduced state in the world. And by seeking to attack and annex the whole of another country where they're treaty bound to respect that country's borders, I mean, it's a lost cause, I'm afraid. You're just losing support, except amongst dictators around the world, but you're losing support from civilized countries.
All right, Sir Gerald, I'm going to give you the last word in just a moment because Andrei had the first word. But Andrei, let me just ask you to respond to some of the comments that have been made there by Sir Gerald.
Oh, well, I think, as I mentioned previously, we only need to find a solution for this crisis. And when we hear the talks that Russia has made an aggression against Ukraine, that Russia breaks any rules, that's not the way to find solution for Ukrainian crisis. I hear, as you talk with me, as I think, so to say, a citizen of some kind of barbarian country. That's not the thing. You can't behave with Russia in the way like that. So if we want a solution for this crisis, we need to sit down, we need to discuss the ways we need to discuss not only Ukraine, but also the security issues in the whole Europe. I mentioned previously that there was the spread of NATO. NATO became very close to Russian borders, and it all threatens Russia. Of course, Russia starts to move. And let's get back to the Ukrainian crisis. What happened in the year 2014 is that the Ukrainian forces started to bombard the people in Donbass. That Donbass that was previously in Ukraine, but now it is the Russian territory. I mean that Russia insisted on that the Minsk agreements should take place, that they must be made signed by President Poroshenko. By the way, President Poroshenko, the former Ukrainian leader, said that when he signed those agreements, he didn't intend to make them, to get them, to make them. This is the problem, and we see this behavior, and this is what made Russia to start its military operation. Now the people in Donbass are freed. Now the people in Crimea are freed. Now there is a new reality on the ground. If the European countries or the United States are not happy with this reality on the ground, then a new reality on the ground will be formed until the Russian conditions will be accepted.
Okay, Sir Gerald, I'll ask you to respond to that, and I want to ask you this final question as well, since you didn't have the opening words in this discussion. Should Ukraine give up any of its territory in the interests of peace, and do you think it will?
It is not a matter for me to tell the Ukrainian people.
That's for Sir Gerald. That's for Sir Gerald. This is the last.
For me to tell the Ukrainian people whether they should give up land or not. That is for the Ukrainian people to decide what sort of outcome they are prepared to accept from any peace talks which eventually take place. But talking to Ukrainians when I was in Lviv earlier this year, they do not want to give up a single square inch of the land that is theirs and does not belong to Russia. And you've just heard all of those watching this in the Gulf. I mean, you've heard it in words of one syllable. Russia, in the form of its new incarnation as the old Soviet Union, believes that the parts of Ukraine which it has taken by force belong to it. And I think it's very sad. Russia is diminished in the world. That is undoubtedly true. The Donbass is not part of Russia. Indeed, the Donbass is not wholly under the control of Russia. But I say this in a spirit of resignation that I think this is all extremely sad. I worked for the Sukhoi Design Bureau. You may have heard of them. They're the company who designed the Su-27 flanker aircraft. And I spent a year working with them to see if we could work together to produce a combat aircraft between the United Kingdom and the new Russia. And so I developed friendships in Russia, and I think this is extremely sad. And it is all down to a president who's absolutely determined to rebuild the Soviet Union and does not care one jot about his own people. His country is falling behind in the world. There's nothing we want to buy from Russia that's made in Russia. We don't want to buy your cars, don't want to buy your airplanes. So, it is very sad indeed, Andrei. But there is only one outcome to this that is acceptable. That is, you withdraw every single one of the soldiers, the conscripts that you have put into eastern Ukraine, and you accept the borders as they were accepted in 1995 by President Boris Yeltsin, and you declare solemnly before God that you will not reinvade Ukraine ever again. That is the only way that can be an outcome. And if you do that, we might be able to talk in a civilized fashion.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Sir Gerald, you had the last word. Sir Gerald Howarth, former UK Defence Minister, thank you for your time. Andrei Antikov, you had the first word. Thank you very much for joining us. Andrei Antikov is a political analyst based in Moscow. Thank you very much indeed to you both, gentlemen. Well, we can speak now to Kurt Volker, who is President Trump's former special envoy for Ukraine negotiations, also former US ambassador to NATO. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, sir. We are now day 1,343 of the war in Ukraine. I'd just like to start by asking you, I know you were there quite recently. What have been the most significant developments in the war in the last couple of months, would you say?
Well, I think Ukraine developing its own long-range strike capabilities to hit infrastructure inside Russia, talking about military facilities, military bases, oil refineries that produce refined fuel for aircraft. They've been able to hit quite a bit inside Russia. That's one big development. The other is the petering out of Russia's ground offensives. They've tried 3 separate offensives this year, in the spring, summer, and now in the autumn, and they have not really been able to take much territory. So we are seeing that Russia is really not capable of advancing, and Ukraine is inflicting more and more damage on Russia. So this has been a bit of a turn of the tide, if you will.
Okay, so I mean, with winter approaching and, you know, what's tended to happen in previous years during the winter is that the lines of the battle are more or less frozen. I mean, are we looking at a pretty unchanged stalemate, would you say, on the battlefield during the next 4 or 5 months?
Yeah. The fact that the lines don't change doesn't prevent people from fighting and many, many people dying. The Russians continue to throw wave after wave of soldiers at the front line who are just killed. And I think that will continue, but I don't expect the front line to change very much. In addition to that, what winter means is the Russians in particular go after the civilian energy infrastructure of Ukraine. They're trying to make people freeze and to put the lights out. And Ukraine has become very resilient, very capable of keeping the lights on, keeping the heat on, but Russia is sending more and more drones and more missiles at civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. So it's going to be a very difficult winter there.
Okay, and in terms of what President Trump is doing on the diplomatic front, he said he will not be meeting with President Putin until he thinks there will be a peace deal. And notably, he has called off the idea of these talks in Budapest. So does that mean he thinks peace talks, at least constructive peace talks, are still a very long way off?
Yes, if you listen to what the Russians are saying, and last week we had that phone call between Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov was articulating the most outrageous absolutist demands before there could be any idea of peace. He was saying that any territory in Ukraine that Russia doesn't control is by definition controlled by Nazis. He's saying they have to get all of the territory. He's saying that Ukraine has to be fully neutral, demilitarized, and subordinate to Russia. This is just an outrageous and maximalist set of demands that neither Ukraine nor Europe could ever agree to. So because of that, President Trump said there's no point in meeting with Vladimir Putin now. My own judgment is that there will never be a peace agreement per se. Putin is never going to recognize the legitimacy of a sovereign Ukraine. He's never going to recognize the legitimacy of Volodymyr Zelenskyy as the leader of Ukraine. And so there won't be such a peace deal. The best we can hope for is that enough pressure is put on Putin that he is forced to agree to a ceasefire.
Right, so that pressure is coming from multiple directions, isn't it? There's the sanctions on the oil company. The Russian economy looks like it's buckling, at least according to some metrics. There's the diplomatic pressure, the pressure on the battlefield. I mean, is that the only way to go, is to force President Putin to come to the negotiating table?
It is, because we know from Putin's own words and those of other Kremlin spokespeople that they are not in any reasonable position at all. They feel that they have a right to commit aggression against their neighbor, a right to control that territory. So the only thing that will bring about a ceasefire is that kind of full court press on Russia to get them to actually stop the fighting. And as you said, there's a lot of pieces in motion right now, more so than there had been happen at any point. The oil company sanctions, possible secondary sanctions on those doing the trading with Russia, seizing the frozen assets that Russia has in Europe and making them available to Ukraine as a reparations loan, the sanctions on gas as well, the military pressure, Ukraine's increasing ability to reach deep inside Russia with its own capabilities, its own drone capabilities. These are, and as you mentioned, the Russian economy, inflation has got to be around 20%. They don't publish reliable statistics, but that's a reasonable guess. And there's a labor shortage as well, negative economic growth, and a huge portion of Russia's state budget is now going to the military, more than is really sustainable for any long period of time.
I mean, the Americans and Ukraine's allies must be hoping this is the case, but I want to ask you, is there any sort of clear indication that this war in Ukraine is starting to really backfire on President Putin? And is he at risk, would you say, in a way that he perhaps wasn't when the war began, domestically speaking? What would you say to that?
Yeah. We're beginning to see a couple of things. We're seeing gasoline shortages inside Russia, which the public notices quite a bit. And that's putting a little bit of domestic pressure on. The fact that he called President Trump before Trump's meeting with Zelenskyy about 2 weeks ago, that I thought was significant as well. He was clearly concerned about the possibility of Tomahawk missiles going to Ukraine and that this would increase the pressure further on Russia. And then the nuclear saber rattling that he did just the other day, he does that when he thinks that cards are being played against him, the pressure is mounting on him, and he's looking for a way to relieve that pressure.
I mean, to be fair, President Trump's position on Ukraine has, let's say, evolved during the course of the last few months since he returned to office 9 months ago. I mean, there have been highs and lows. There have been moments when he sounded very supportive, other moments when he sounded not in the least sympathetic. At least that's how he sounded. I haven't said that's what he was. Yeah. But where would you say that sort of sentiment is right now in the mind of the president? How do you think he feels at this particular moment about Ukraine?
Well, of course, only President Trump can say how he's thinking about this himself. No one really knows for sure. But the way it seems to me, he has really all along, from the beginning of his term here, has wanted a negotiated deal. And he thought it would be easy because he can push Ukraine a little bit and get them to accept a ceasefire in place, which he has done. He's maneuvered to get Ukraine and the United States in line economically. So we're no longer spending taxpayer money to prop up Ukraine. People are buying weapons. We have a minerals and natural resources deal where we can put money into an investment fund in Ukraine. So he's made this much more of a commercially viable proposition. And he thought that offering a good deal to Vladimir Putin is something Putin would take up and it would end the war. And I think what he has now realized is that Putin is never going to accept a deal. He's never going to end the war. And so we do have to turn up the pressure the way we've just been discussing. So I think that change in Trump's attitude has really been since that failed summit in Alaska in middle of August.
Right. So President Trump feels like he's done everything he could reasonably be expected to do. Concessions have been made on Ukraine's behalf by President Trump. And you're quoted as saying that, in fact, President Putin's real goal here is simply to absorb Ukrainian territory into Russian territory. Do correct me if I'm misquoting you. But would you say it's fair to say that the Trump administration is just entirely fed up with the stalemate and the sort of going around in circles here?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, going around in circles, I think that is actually a quote from President Trump, or being led around in circles, I believe is what he said. He has tried, as you said, everything. He's met with Putin. He's called Putin. He's offered things to Putin. He's offered lifting of sanctions. He's offered restoring the G8. He has invited Putin to meet with him in Alaska. And every step of the way, Putin has rejected any reasonable offers and insisted on continuing continuing the war, and continuing the war really in some of the most atrocious ways, bombing kindergartens, bombing hospitals, taking out civilian infrastructure, hitting apartment buildings. This is a brutal attack by Russia on Ukraine. And as you say, I think President Trump, having tried everything, is now very, very frustrated and has said many times now that he has nice conversations with Putin, but then they don't amount to anything.
One thing he hasn't tried, though, is, really dialing up the temperature here and providing Ukraine with significantly more material support to, try and win this battle and repel the invading forces. I mean, do you think that's something that he might entertain as an idea?
Yeah, he certainly has not taken that off the table. He was musing publicly about 2 weeks ago about sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, which would be a significant step if he did. He didn't do it when Zelenskyy visited. He thought that Putin was making one more effort to negotiate. That evaporated, and Trump has not taken the idea of Tomahawk missiles or other military support off the table. It's still out there. I think he wants to avoid that. He doesn't want to be in a direct confrontation with Russia, but he is capable and prepared if necessary.
So were you to advise President Trump, I mean, which road would you suggest he went down? Would it be the road of concessions, negotiations, appeasement, or brute force, or perhaps a combination of all of them?
Well, I think he has tried all of the appeasement side of that you just described, and it hasn't worked. So he has to try the other. And the other is going to be not only the sanctions on the oil companies that we just did, but secondary sanctions on anyone who is doing business with those oil companies. So it would have to be hitting vessels, ports, refineries, banks, insurance companies in China, in India, anyone who's doing that kind of trade with Russia, which is what's funneling the money to the Kremlin to continue the war. And I would provide much more military equipment, particularly the long-range Tomahawk missiles, to Ukraine. But I would tell the Ukrainians, don't use them right now. And if we get a ceasefire, keep them, and that'll be your deterrent. But if Putin continues to refuse a ceasefire, then we're not going to have a choice but tell the Ukrainians, okay, then go ahead, hit longer range, take out those things in Russia, the drone factories, the missile factories that are being used to hit you.
And just lastly, would you say the Americans and the Europeans have now come rather closer together, let's say, than they were back in January, February, on the issue of how to end this conflict?
Definitely. One of the things that President Trump did, we talked about getting the U.S. and Ukraine aligned politically, about ending the war, and aligned economically. Another thing President Trump did was to rebalance the U.S.-European military relationship. He has always felt, and every president has felt, the U.S. was doing too much and Europe too little. Europe is now committed to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. They are buying weapons in order to provide them to Ukraine. They are talking about a coalition of the willing to be present on the ground in Ukraine to deter future Russian attacks. So Europe has stepped up quite a bit now, and we are much better aligned between the U.S. and Europe than we were at the beginning of this administration.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Kurt Volker, President Trump's former special envoy for Ukraine negotiations. Thank you, sir. We can speak now to John Herbst, former US ambassador to Ukraine. He joins us now from the United States. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
There have been more Russian drone attacks on Ukraine's capital during the last 2 days or so. The civilian death toll keeps rising. When it comes to what's happening on the battlefield, have we seen any sort of strategic breakthroughs, would you say, in the last few days and weeks?
We haven't seen any strategic breakthrough since Russia began its latest offensive many, many months ago. They've taken at most 1% of Ukrainian territory, and they've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and a tremendous amount of equipment. And they have not made any breakthrough in Western Donbass, the cities of Pokrovsk, and then, of course, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which is a highly fortified area. So the Russian war effort is not doing very well.
Okay, and in terms of how President Trump views this long-running conflict, approaching the 4-year mark now that it is, he's called off those talks in Budapest that were going to happen. I mean, do you think that means that he thinks this is, there is nothing to negotiate at this stage?
Well, he's recognized that Putin's not interested in peace. That's why he decided not to go to Budapest. You know, Putin gets him on the phone and tries to charm him, and he sounds very nice, but then he makes no real commitment about ending the shooting. That's why, as opposed to what happened in August, when Witkoff met with Putin and then they decided to go to the summit in Alaska, this time after the phone call a couple of weeks ago, Trump said, okay, yeah, well, we can meet in Budapest, but I want Rubio to work out the agenda beforehand. And so Rubio had a phone call with Lavrov, and Lavrov pointed out that the Russian position has not changed. And Trump said there's no reason to have a summit.
So what do you think is going to get President Putin to the negotiating table? Anything, or do you think the negotiating table is just going to be have to be put to one side? And that being the case, what does he do?
I don't rule out Putin coming to negotiate, but only when he's experiencing serious problems with his war effort. Meaning, 1, major pressure on the Russian economy, and 2, serious problems on the battlefield. Well, Russia's made no great gains, they have made small gains. And the generals lie to Putin, say, we're going to make much greater gains next week. And so Putin continues the war. But if we sent major new weapons to Ukraine, and Ukraine uses them to put some serious pressure on Russians on the battlefield, Putin may decide that he's unable to conquer more Ukrainian territory, and he may decide to negotiate seriously. But without substantial additional pressure from the United States and the West, Putin will not negotiate.
And when it comes to that economic pressure, I mean, what indicators are there that it's having the desired effect on Moscow?
Well, I don't have any doubt that the sanctions we've been putting on since the big invasion, even before, have cost the Russian economy maybe 1% of GDP growth a year. But those sanctions were never going to make Putin simply give up. The sanctions that Trump put down earlier this week are very powerful. They will be a further blow to the Russian already stumbling economy. But unless it's fathered by additional sanctions and pressure on the military side, I think Putin will simply continue his war. Putin thinks he can outlast Trump the way he outlasted Biden, the way he outlasted Merkel, and so on. Trump has to show him that he's different, and he'll just keep on ramping up the pressure. And I'm hoping that what we saw this week with the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil is just the start.
Right. I mean, Ukraine and its allies in Europe, let's say, must be hoping that President Putin eventually realizes this was a massive miscalculation and this is not an exercise to be repeated in other parts of Europe. I mean, do you think President Trump is now absolutely aligned with those European leaders that really want to make sure President Putin is stopped in his tracks and doesn't try any further territorial expansion?
President Trump is mercurial. So I'd hesitate to say he's now pretty much in lockstep with the folks in Europe who understand how dangerous Putin is. But at the present time, he clearly understands that Putin has rejected half a dozen or more of Trump's own peace offers, which Zelenskyy accepted. And therefore, he is doing what he said he would do. He's putting pressure on the recalcitrant party in this war. And some of my colleagues have felt Trump was never going to do what he did on Monday, but he has. And I've always felt that Trump's stated desire to achieve a durable peace to this war, to end this war, would eventually force him to put pressure on Russia. And we are beginning to see that now.
President Trump is going to be meeting President Xi of China later on this week. And I'm wondering whether you think there's anything to be achieved with regards to Ukraine in their discussions.
I think the increasing spotlight that the United States, among others, is placing on Chinese support for Russia's aggression in Ukraine makes China uncomfortable. I don't think it by itself is going to change Chinese policy. What the Chinese foreign minister told his European colleagues, I don't know, a month or two ago, that it's in Russia's interest, it's in China's interest for Russia to continue and win this war. So that is the geopolitical calculation of Xi. But we can make it uncomfortable for him. So maybe he has to at least tone down the support he's giving to Russia by buying Russian oil and by sending Russia dual-use technology for weapons, if not some weapons as well.
Do you see a scenario in which some sort of a solution is found to this crisis without Ukraine having to give up large swathes of its territory?
I believe that given the policy outlook of the Trump administration, we can achieve a durable peace where Russia on a de facto basis occupies much of the territory it currently controls today, but only de facto. And that since Russia would continue to control de facto a lot of that territory, some serious sanctions would remain in place. That, I think, is a viable outcome in the year or two or three to come. That's not my preference, but I'm not the president of the United States. So given what Trump is willing to accept, and a durable peace is not a terrible outcome, it's just not necessarily a just one, can work for most Ukrainians, for the United States, for NATO, and for Europe overall. It does not work right now for Putin, who wants to conquer and have control of most, if not all, of Ukraine.
And just lastly, I mean, from where you sit, I mean, have you seen or heard anything that sounds like a concession coming from the Russian side during these 7-8 months that President Trump has been making overtures to the Russians to try to engage them?
I'm unaware of any concession. I mean, conceivably, if Putin were to decide he cannot take more Ukrainian territory at an acceptable cost, he might be willing to concede that, yes, the war, he's willing to put down his arms as long as he retains the control on at least a de facto basis of the territory he currently occupies. That's how I see this eventually ending, unless, of course, the Russian economy collapses, which is possible, or the Ukrainians make a major breakthrough on the battlefield, which I think is possible, although not likely, or if there's a coup in Moscow, which I think is not likely, but not impossible.
Well, it's a very interesting set of possible scenarios there. Unfortunately, we're out of time, because I'd love to talk to you about them a bit more. But thank you very much indeed. John Herbst, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you for your time, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We're joined now by Major General Chip Chapman, who is a security and military expert and former head of British counter-terrorism. He joins us from the United Kingdom. General Chapman, thank you very much indeed for your time. It is today apparently day 1,343 of the war in Ukraine. It seems like there's been something of an intensification in the drone warfare aspect of this battle. I'd just like to ask you, what is your assessment as things stand of where the war is heading?
Well, it's heading for a stalemate, and I think that's what we're seeing more of from the Russian perspective. From the Russian commentators are saying that the war has reached a strategic and political dead end. The problem is no one seems to know how to get out of that dead end. In terms of the drones, there's two parts to that. In terms of the tactical battle on the front line, 80% of the deaths are now caused by drones. So the command of the air, the decentralization of air power, is what controls the battlefield now. The one which has caught the attention, and that's the one which is setting the framework for the future, really, both in terms of diplomacy and the military effects, is the deep strike drones, both cruise missiles and drones. And from a Ukrainian perspective, I think there are two aspects to that. There's the Western inventory, which they want for the future, particularly Tomahawk missiles. But one thing that the Ukrainians have done is gone from zero capability at the start of the war to a capability now when they have their own Neptune, Flamingo, and 5.1 missiles, which can reach up to 1,350 kilometers. It is that deep strike on the oil refineries which is degrading the economic potential of Russia. Whether that leads to an implosion of the Russian economy and pressure points on Putin internally in the same way that the sanctions will do that externally is one of those variables in war which is just not known at the moment.
Okay, so you make a lot of important points there. I mean, since you mentioned the Tomahawks, let's get straight onto those, because they were what President Zelenskyy hoped he was going to leave Washington with when he was there 10 days or so ago. Why do you think President Trump hesitated and did not grant him use of the long-range Tomahawk missiles?
Well, I think Trump has a strategic hesitancy based on the fact, two things really. Firstly, he thought it might be escalatory, and the Russians indeed said that in terms of both targets, geography, because it expands the battlefield, and objectives from the Ukrainian perspective. But I think the second point is that he absolutely believes in this humanitarian peace as he sees it. Last week, his key phrase was "go home, stop killing people and be done." So that is the way he sees it. He doesn't see things in terms of winning or losing or achieving strategic objectives for either side. He sees it in terms of stopping the killing. And that's, I think, the second reason that he didn't give them that capability. However, it does remain a quiver in that he can give in the future. The diplomatic or sanctions pressure is ratcheted up, but not the military pressure in terms of that capability.
And since you mentioned this sort of escalatory interpretation of supplying those Tomahawks, what do you think is the fear that Russia might do in the event that the US were to provide such weaponry?
I don't think there is a fear from most people who know about these things, because there's been no sanctuary for Ukraine since day one. The Russian missiles reached to the Polish border on day one of the conflict. Ukraine didn't have that capability. So in terms of the geography, there is no sanctuary now in European Russia. What you get from the Russians, and have had in the last few days, is an escalatory upping of rhetoric. That is why you've seen them saying that they've started testing a new nuclear cruise missile. And you've had also statements saying that the use of, or the potential use of Tomahawks would be deemed to be an act of war. It is supposed to deter the West from providing those capabilities. They've often been very good at doing that.
Since you mentioned that Russian nuclear-powered cruise missile, I believe it's called the Burevestnik. Apparently it has an impressive range, it flies low, it could reach the United States, apparently. Do correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, is it a game changer? What sort of a message is Russia sending out by unveiling this type of weaponry?
What it's generally doing is desist or else. It did this late last year with the Oreshnik ballistic missile when it fired one of those. I don't think it is the capability that they say it is at the moment. The Americans will have been measuring it from a thing we call MASINT, measurement intelligence. And they've often had hyperbole on some of their other missile systems, particularly the hypersonic ones. But there have been a number of or else moments from the Russians. We've had or else will starve you in terms of the grain, or else will freeze you in terms of the attacks on the infrastructure. This is a or else and back off. We're not going to negotiate yet. Please don't get escalatory. It does deter some people in the West, because as soon as you use the nuclear word, people fear that we're going to what we call spasm warfare. We're not going to be near that, and neither are we in an imminent posture of any nuclear war in the future.
Okay, I mean, do you think we are entering a sort of an economic war of attrition, in the sense that you've got these pretty cheap drones that are being fired at Ukraine on a daily basis, hundreds of them, and they're being met by this very expensive air defense system, which is being supplied by the West? And I'm wondering whether you think it's part of Russia's calculation to clock up huge cost to the West and deplete its resources. I mean, do you think that's part of their calculation?
Well, they'd be wrong if they thought that, because, of course, the economic potential of the West, when fully mobilized, far exceeds that of Russia. But like all these things, a variable in war is how much support will Russia get from China or Iran or North Korea, and ultimately how much support will Ukraine get both from European Western Europe and from the USA. And it's those variables which make it very difficult to get to a posture when you negotiate. No one is currently strong enough on the battlefield to concede a need to be in a position of negotiations. Russia wants a surrender peace. That's where all its root causes come from. Ukraine is not going to concede that. Ukraine wants a just peace. That is completely opposed to the surrender peace. And those are so far apart in the moment that we've got chasm analysis rather than gap analysis in terms of game theory and how you bring negotiations and diplomacy to bear.
Okay, so I mean, those who say President Putin only understands one thing, and that is force. I don't know if you're one of them, but if that is the case, I mean, what sort of a strategy should that dictate by Ukraine's allies?
Well, there are three parts to it. The first one is sanctions, and they should be upped. We saw the first use of sanctions last week in Trump 2.0 in sanctioning two of the large Russian oil companies. What we might expect in the future, and the Senate has said he's going to, or they're going to let the president lead on this, is that the Americans will, one hopes, put secondary sanctions on those who consume Russian oil. That is 5% secondary sanctions that would particularly hit China and India, which would probably desist from that. I think OPEC countries have said they'll, the void that created by the sanctioning, they will up that. That's a bad sign for Putin. The second thing is they need continuing military support, and if they get long-range weapons, that would be helpful. The third thing that President Trump always mentioned was that he would collapse the Russian economy if he could bring the oil price down to $45 a barrel. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think it was significant many years ago when Senator John McCain used to say that Russia is no more than a gas station with nukes masquerading as a country. There is quite a lot you could do to bring about the demise of Russia economically on that economic pillar of Russia, particularly through the oil prism, because that's a lot of their GDP comes from oil and gas.
Okay, so these combined tactics, diplomatic pressure, force on the battlefield, are these, do you think, going to have the effect of bringing President Putin to the negotiating table?
I think they will yet. And I think we obviously look at this through a Western prism, but as an analyst, you always look at the sort of weaknesses in what you're analysing. And one of the things where we have potentially a blind spot is what we call the fundamental attribution error when we look at Putin through a prism of the West. And the prism that he looks at it is he wants to achieve his strategic objectives, which is to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. I don't think he's knocked off that pillar. And indeed, all the sort of statements from those around him, Lavrov, the foreign minister, sort of saying that ceasefire is a road to nowhere, or Peskov, his spokesman, saying that Russia will continue fighting till they've achieved their objectives militarily, doesn't lead you into a position where you think that he's going to be in a position where he wants to negotiate anytime soon.
I mean, it's been 3 years and 7 months since this war began, and you just quoted John McCain a little earlier on what he thought of Russia, whenever that was 15 or 20 years ago, when he made those comments. But what do you think we've learned during these last 3.5 years or so about Russia's military capabilities? Do you think it's still accurate to describe Russia as a military superpower?
No, it's not. I think it was more akin to what Trump said a couple of weeks ago, that it's more of a paper tiger. There was this notion when we started this war that it was the second army in the world. I don't think it is at all. But again, it is this army or a state which has multiple nuclear missiles. And that's what makes it really, really dangerous if it were to lash out. And indeed, if it were to be significantly defeated, and there were to be a case for Russia being, the Russian Federation being broken apart, and if Putin were to be blamed for that, then he could lash out with tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think we're anywhere near that at the moment, but that is the worst case scenario which Western intelligence analysts always look at.
And just lastly, General Chapman, I just wanted to ask you a quick question, sort of really drawing on your counter-terrorism credentials, because there have been reports of Russia-linked arson attacks in the United Kingdom. I just wondered what you made of those attacks and whether you think it indicates perhaps the start of a new phase in this conflict.
Well, I don't think it's a new phase. There's always been that sort of these intelligence agencies, particularly MI5, whose director gave a speech last week, have always had a significant proportion of their effort against other states' activities. That has been going up. So from a UK perspective, international terrorism was the #1 priority, followed by domestic terrorism, particularly in Northern Ireland, and then about 20% to those state threats from sort of China and Russia. That latter one, China and Russia, has gone up recently, and that's to do with the notion of hybrid warfare, where you can achieve your objectives by other means. That is the force of politics rather than the politics of force. So you achieve your goals by deniable attacks or propaganda and subversion. That's where we're seeing more effort being put in by the Russians and counter effort by the Western intelligence agencies. Because again, in military philosophy, the cheapest way to achieve your objectives is by not fighting. If you can achieve it by that force of politics, it's far cheaper than going to war.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you very much indeed. Really interesting talking to you. Major General Chip Chapman, security and military expert and former head of British counter-terrorism in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.